Hi, I'm Kathleen Gros, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about page layout and how it relates to comics. I'll just do a really quick about me before we dive in. I'm a Vancouver-based cartoonist. My first graphic novel was published by Cloudscape Comics in 2015. I've been releasing another graphic novel-length work as a webcomic since then. It's called Lunar Maladies. And I have a middle grade graphic novel coming out from HarperCollins later this year. It's called Joe. So cool, now that you know a little bit about me, let's move on with the workshop. The general structure of this workshop is that I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic guidelines and concepts to keep in mind while laying out a page, and then I'm going to take a one-page example script that I've prepared and show you 3 different approaches that I could take when laying out that page. All right, are we ready? Let's go. So first things first, let's just talk about some general terms. They're not going to come up too much in the workshop today, but I think that they're useful just to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about making comics. So trim line, a trim line is sort of like the size of your page of comics. It's like the edges of the physical paper, essentially. If you're getting something professionally printed, the printer will usually be cutting down pages, trimming them down to the final size. So, for example, if your comic's final size was 6.5 inches by 10 inches, it would be printed on paper that was a little bit bigger and then cut down to that size. So that's what we mean when we say trim line. Then we've also got bleed is a concept. It's very metal sounding, but bleed is just like this little bit of extra space that you can add around your page. It's really for the printer's benefit. When something is said to be full bleed, what it means is that the artwork doesn't stop before the edge of the page. It keeps going all the way to the edge of the page. All the artwork just goes to the edge of the page. In order for that to print properly, as the artist, you actually have to draw the artwork bigger than the size of the page, because like I just said, when the printer prints pages, they trim them down to size. So there's always like a little margin of error, sort of size-wise, as to exactly what part gets cut off. So you go past the edge of the page, so that you don't have any like awkward like little white gaps when you actually wanted everything to just explode off of the page beautifully. If you're getting something printed, you should always just be checking with your printer as to what their specifications are. But generally, if you're not thinking about that yet, adding about 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch around your page should be fine. And then there's another term called the live area, and that's sort of like where your artwork that isn't going full bleed lives on the page. Like I said, there's like a little bit of a margin for when printers are trimming down pages. Like it's not exact, perfect every time. So it might be like a millimeter off or whatever, sometimes a little bit more in either direction on the page. So you just don't want any like super important information to be outside of the live area on your page, because it might get cut off by accident or like lost in the sort of spine of a book. So general idea is just to keep anything important away from like 1/4 inch from the edge of the page. And then, so those terms that I just talked about, not quite as important for what we're talking about here today. We're mostly going to be talking about panels and how panels get arranged on the page. So panels, of course, are the boxes that your art lives in. They are fundamental to comics. I'm sure you already know what they are if you are here at this workshop. But just in case, I'm making sure that we're all on the same figurative page here. We've got panels. And then we've got gutters, which are the spaces in between panels. And sometimes gutters can be quite large, sometimes they can be quite narrow, sometimes they can be non-existent. But that's just what a gutter means. So I'm not going to talk too much about these terms today, but I think they're helpful to know, especially as we just go into talking about the page in more detail. Also, if you don't really know where to start with these things and these measurements sound a bit confusing, you know, they're just sort of general ideas. They're not hard rules necessarily. And you can totally buy Bristol, like Opus, Desserts, all these places will carry it, should carry it. And it has like the blue guidelines printed on the Bristol, which can be helpful as a jumping off point. So let's talk about comics. You know, hypothetically, you've got a page that you want to draw, but you're just not quite sure where to start. For me, I've usually got a script written at this point. Everybody's process looks different. Some people maybe just have like point form notes about what needs to happen on the page, or some super loose thumbnails. Any of those are totally fine. The cool thing about comics is that, you know, you can make them however you want, and whatever process feels right to you is great. So for the purposes of this workshop, I'm going to be referencing my own process, which is that I usually start with a script, and then I thumbnail from that script and sort of go back and forth as I'm editing. So we're starting out, we've got our script, we know what story we want to tell, and we've got a blank piece of paper staring us in the face. Where on earth do we start? So there's a series of decisions that you're going to need to make as you try and translate the beautiful story happening in your head onto the paper. So the first decision that you'll need to make is what size and dimension you want your comic pages to be. Industry standard, like for superheroes and stuff, is to have a live area. So the artwork on the page stays in sort of like guidelines of 6 inches by 9 inches, which means that the page is a little bit bigger than that and sort of like averages out to be 6.5 inches by 10 inches or a little bit smaller. But that's not set in stone. You can really do whatever you want with your page dimensions. I love to play around with the size and shape of my pages. I just think it's really fun. It keeps me on my toes, keeps things interesting. If you're planning on self-publishing your comics as zines, which I think is a really great thing to do, it's a good idea to make your page size proportionate to like half of a sheet of letter size paper, so 11 by 8.5 inches, and then half of that will be your page, because this is like a 2-page spread here almost. So like having whatever size you're drawing at be proportionate to 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches will be great, because then easy to format for print. I usually draw about 1.5 times bigger than print size, just because 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches is super tiny to me. And also when I shrink down my artwork that's bigger to be a little bit smaller, any sort of like wobbly lines or imperfections look a little bit neater and nicer. But yeah, you can see like this page size and this page size, they're kind of like similar proportions, like this vertical rectangle, which is great, but why do we have to make our pages this sort of like size and dimension? We don't have to. We can kind of like do whatever we want if we want to. This is a page from my comic called Work Nemesis that I made a couple years ago. That's just like a silly little romance comic, but I made all the pages in this comic square. I did this because I'd been working a lot with sort of like regular rectangles, and I found myself falling back on using the same layouts and panel compositions like over and over again, and I wasn't experimenting enough. So I kind of felt like I was stagnating a little. So changing things up with square pages forced me to think more critically about how layout works, and forced me to come up with completely new ideas, which is great. Another thing that I've been playing around with in the past couple of years is I flipped that upright rectangle on its side for my comic Lunar Maladies. This comic is like a werewolf murder mystery comic, essentially. You can see more examples of it online at lunarmaladies.com. But this comic was originally designed as a webcomic, even though little bits of it have seen print at different times. I just wanted to make sure that this comic would read well on desktop screens. So, you know, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll probably notice it's kind of proportionate to a computer screen. So that's why I chose this page shape, is because I was envisioning it being read on a computer. And I wanted to make sure that my pages could be viewed in their entirety comfortably on the computer without having to sort of scroll or like having panels cut off in weird ways. As well, Lunar Melodies is a really slow-paced comic. It takes up like 467 pages, and most of those pages have between like 1 and 5 panels on the page. Like 5 panels is a lot of panels on the page for Lunar Melodies. And flipping this rectangle on its side like this kind of forced me to draw fewer panels on the page, just because of how this sort of dimension and size works with layout. So yeah, it felt like a good fit. And then as well, this is just a completely weird thing I did a while ago. This is my comic called I Don't Want to Talk About My Feelings, which can be read on my website. It's sort of about a trip I took on some other stuff. This comic is really long and skinny. Essentially, this is a letter size sheet of paper, but instead of folding it like a hamburger, I folded it like a hot dog. So the pages are super long and skinny, which is a very weird page dimension. And I did this because I designed this comic for scrolling on a phone or a computer. Like I said, like it's up on my website, so it's just like designed to essentially be an infinite scroll with no real page breaks or like set panel layouts, the same way that I would for something that was for print. So when I brought it to print, I wanted to try and figure out how I could capture that sort of scrolling feel almost with my print work. So I went for these like really long skinny pages. Yeah, so changing up your pages can help your work stand out. It's a fun challenge as an artist. Like I said, I like to experiment with page shapes because I find it keeps me from falling into the same layout habits over and over again. I think it's good to play around and change things up. It keeps your art and mind fresh and like helps you build some new skills and like new ways of thinking. So like I said, I tend to write a script and then thumbnail from that script and then like make edits on the script based on my thumbnails. But whether you write a script first and then create thumbnails, or maybe you only create thumbnails. I know people who that's how they write, is they create the thumbnails for their comic. You know, no matter what you do, there's just a few things you need to keep in mind as you start to think about the actual finished comics page. I think that generally it's a good idea to create rough thumbnails of your pages because they're kind of like a roadmap for the finished page that you're going to draw later. These are what my thumbnails look like. We'll probably look at these again later on. These are for my book, Joe, that's coming out later this year. I did these in a notebook, but you can see it's like super messy, stick figures. We're just trying to figure out where things go on the page and what panels go where. As well as where does the text go. So yeah, it's super rough and it's really only meant to be used for my reference to remind myself months down the road what I intended for the page when I actually sit down to draw it. So like I said, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind when we're planning out our pages. So here are 4 things that I've isolated that I think it's really important to think about when we want to draw a page. So the first is how many panels are on the page. The second is where do the panels go. The third is what's happening in these panels. And then the fourth is where the word balloon's placed. And even though these are in like an itemized list, you don't have to do this in any particular order. These are all kind of questions you should be thinking about simultaneously. But I'm going to go through them in this order just to break it down because I think that'll be a little bit clearer. So, okay, how many panels are on the page? This really comes down to personal preference. Personally, I try not to exceed about 7 panels on a page, but that's just me. I like a slightly slower paced story where the panels and scenes have space to breathe. And for the work I do, I don't really have like tight page counts where I'm trying to cram as much information as possible into the page in order to get as much story into a finite number of pages. I can just do what I want. So I like fewer panels on the page. Sometimes, however, it makes sense to put tons of panels on a page, but it's hard to keep things from feeling cramped when you do that, especially if you have a lot of dialogue or text. One of the artists I really like to look at for someone who can very effectively cram like up to 20 panels on a page is Adrian Tomanet. Somehow he just makes it work. So yeah, if you're like, I want to put as many panels as possible on a page, maybe take a look at what he's doing because he does it well. I also like to think of the page as its own sort of like beat in a story. I like to find the moments where it makes sense to put a slight pause of turning the page or moving my eye over to the other side of the spread. For example, if I'm leading up to a reveal, I might end the page right before the reveal and then put the reveal on the next page. So here are just some like examples of sort of my different approaches to figuring out how many panels are on a page. This page and the next couple of pages with sort of this teal color scheme. These are from a story that I had in an anthology called The Witching Hours that came out from Cloudscape last year. And all the stories are about witches and stuff, but I had a really finite page count for this story, so this is why I have quite a few panels on each page, because yeah, I had like very little space to put a bunch of ideas into. So this is actually a little bit atypical to how I usually sort of panel things. But yeah, so essentially it's like these two witches, they're talking in their cabin, and one is like, I'm gonna go out to the woods and collect some flowers, and the other one's like, I don't know, that sounds kind of dangerous. And the one who goes out into the woods gets possessed by a demon. So when I was saying before about like thinking about the different beats and separating them, I really felt like these 3 pages show 3 distinct moments in the story that felt kind of like their own thing that could be separate, and like a page turn would be effective in between them. So like the first page is the setting up of the story. We've got the introduction of the characters. They are they're talking about going into the woods. And then on the next page, they go into the woods and start to be followed by this shadowy specter. And then the specter engages with the character. So it's sort of like 3 things. First page, talking about going into the woods. Second page, actually going into the woods. Third page, getting possessed by a specter. So those are 3 separate ideas, and why sort of the page splits go there. Another comic example, this is from my comic Lunar Maladies. Like I said, there are way fewer panels on the page here. This is one whole page. It's just like a giant panel. And then here's another page where there's like 3 panels on it. And this one is 5, which is like, oh, that's a lot of panels for Lunar Maladies. Mostly because I was trying to get through some dialogue. So it's like this page is really setting the scene. I wanted one full panel to show sort of like where my characters were, and then sort of show a little bit more of the characters and the context, and then get into some dialogue. So once we sort of figure out how we want to split up the moments of our script into pages, then we sort of need to figure out how the panels get arranged on the page. Like, where do the panels go? So yeah, once you've determined what actions or events or dialogue you want to have on your page, you've got to figure out how all those puzzle pieces fit together. There's a lot to think about when considering the sizes, shapes, and placements of your panels, but ultimately just trust your gut. You know, your instincts are usually really good. The sizes and shapes of your panels will influence the pacing of your comic. This page here has sort of like bigger, fewer panels. The bigger your panels, the slower time seems to pass. The smaller your panels, the quicker time seems to pass. And you can use this to your advantage. So this page here is just like a really quick example that I drew. And it's a calm and quiet sort of moment. So if your story is calm and quiet, it might serve you well to have fewer panels on your page, which will allow them to be bigger and take up more space. And then on the flip side, this is also just a really quick example that I drew up. You know, do you have a fast-paced story with quick and quippy dialogue? It might serve you well to have more panels on your page, which by necessity makes those panels smaller. So it feels like time is passing a lot quicker on the page. And of course, you can use the contrast between these two ideas to add emphasis to your story. Like here, I've got all these small panels of these characters arguing, and then one like gasps in surprise, but like, what if that whole bottom row was one big panel that said like gasp? That would, you know, heighten the emotional impact of that moment instead of having it just be like one tiny panel amid a bunch of other tiny panels. As well, the sizes of your panels can denote how important a moment is. So you can like look at the moments on your page and decide which moment is most important and work backwards from there. So in this like loose example that I've done, the biggest panel here, I would put what I thought was the most important action, and then the least important action in the smallest panel, and then sort of like try and jigsaw everything together. We'll talk about that more when I show you the example pages that I'm going to draw. One thing, you know, no matter what you do, no matter what approach we take, one thing that we always want to make sure of, no matter what we're doing, is that our layouts make intuitive sense. Our readers are always going to be looking to follow a path on the page that guides them from left to right and from up to down. So when in doubt, if you're like looking at your page and you're like, I don't know what's going on, remember, left to right, up to down. Ask yourself, is what I've done effectively guiding the reader in the right direction? So there's one style of panel layout that is pretty generally understood to be visually confusing, and it's this one that I've thrown up on the screen here. The reason why it's confusing is that when the reader finishes the first panel, they're not really sure if they should move to the panel to the right or to the panel that's below. So lots of people will be like, never use this panel layout, it's bad, but I don't believe in following rules strictly. We can totally use this panel layout if we want to. I don't really use it because I think that it can more often than not trip up the reader and interrupt the flow, and I want to keep the reading experience of my comic as smooth as possible, but you can really do what you want. Rules are meant to be broken, and if you want to break this rule, I just wanted to show you a couple things that you could do to break it effectively. One of my favorite artists who occasionally uses this layout is Melanie Gilman. If you haven't checked out their work, you really should. They're just like one of the best cartoonists working today, I think. Gilman does this thing sometimes where they will strategically adjust the shape of their panels like this to quite literally point the reader in the right direction. Like this first panel is literally an arrow, which I think is it's very fun. Another thing you can do is like adjusting the size of your gutters. This creates a big divide if you want people to read, you know, the top panel and then the bottom panel and then move over to the right. Or you can show the left panels really distinctly as their own thing. So if they have panel borders and then maybe the one on the right doesn't have panel borders at all, in the reader's eye, it creates like a distinct separation between the two things. So yeah, do what you want, but just like be aware that it can be a little bit confusing. So you want to make choices that make it less confusing. So once you sort of like figure out where your panels go, you want to figure out how you're framing each panel, like what is happening in each panel. The way we position our characters and environmental elements in our panels can subtly guide the reader around the page. So this is a page from a comic that I was working on with James Brandy. It's called Shedding Velvet, and this page, there's like, I laid it out, I penciled it, no, she did thumbnails, I penciled it, and then she inked it. So it's kind of, and I colored it, we like both worked on this page, but there are some subtle things I did while I was penciling it to kind of like try and point the reader in the right direction. So as you can see here, like this aisle in the cafeteria creates a strong line to point up to this character that character one is looking at, and then they're stacked on top of each other, so it kind of just like leads your eye right down. And then I mean, there's not really a lot of confusion in this panel, but the way I've stacked the word balloons is to just draw the eye down like that. Similarly, this is a panel from a page from Work Nemesis. Again, it's not a super complicated layout, so your reader's not really going to get confused, but there's definitely some things I did compositionally that were like intending to sort of like push people left to right, up to down in the page. So we've got this like strong horizontal lines going on in panel 1, and then panel 2, there's kind of like this angle between the one character and the other character's shoulder, and then again, just like pointing back into this last panel here. Another thing to think about is just thinking about your page as a whole. Is it a dialogue heavy scene with very little action? If so, like if you'll remember that argument scene that I showed, that was sort of like all talking heads. It's kind of boring to look at. Let me see, it was this page. Yeah, everything's kind of framed the same. So what about switching up viewpoints, like bird's eye view, worm's eye view, show people far away, show close-ups, varying that, sort of showing different environmental elements will just make the scene that much more interesting. Okay, back down to here. Oh yeah, okay. So this is just like something you want to be careful of if you're doing that, sort of like changing up, you know, the viewpoint of the camera and stuff, is you just don't really want to break the 180-degree rule, which is a rule from film. So here we can see in the middle, it's like two characters being shown from a bird's eye view, and then like if you put the camera in one position, it looks like the person in pink is on the right and the person in blue is on the left, and then if you put the camera in a different position, it looks like it's flipped. It's just something you want to be careful of in scenes with 2 or more characters. We just want to make sure that their placement and positioning within the scene stays consistent and clear for the reader. We just don't want to confuse them, because it can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. Yeah, this is especially important if you've got a scene that relies on actions or props and stuff like that. So of course there are situations where you can break this rule. I try not to break it, even though I kind of feel like any rule about making art is really just a general guideline more than anything. So if you understand the ins and the outs of any concept well enough, you can play around with it and like inverse it and change things around, invert it and change things around. So for example, if you've made the setting of a scene incredibly clear, you can kind of get away with breaking the 180-degree rule. If you've drawn a detailed background and have key points of scenery that can be referenced in relation to your characters, then yeah, go ahead, break that 180-degree rule. Because like, if people know where the teapot is, I don't know, in relation to the characters in the scene, and you flip it around, they can, you know, tell what's going on. But also just like take a moment to think about if switching up the framing like that is really necessary. Does it improve the story in some way? It could be worth it. It might not be. Everything is a choice, just make it deliberate. So finally, although not finally, because this is actually super important, where are the word balloons placed on your page? You gotta figure it out. So word balloons are one of, if not the most iconic symbols of comics. They, you know, you see this, you know it's comics. It's like almost definitive of the medium in some ways. Word balloons are where the dialogue goes. They're how the reader knows who is speaking. And there's a couple of important things we want to keep in mind with word balloons. First off, we want to make sure that we've left enough space for them in our art. There is nothing worse than having to cut off or hide some of your art because you didn't leave enough room for your word balloons. Also, this is just a little tip. If you're having trouble fitting your text into one panel without it feeling squished, that's a really good indicator that you should actually split that panel up into 2 panels. Because if you're having trouble fitting it all in, means probably got one or more ideas in there, and you can find some way to split it up and have 2 panels that breathe a little better than 1 panel that's super jam-packed. So back to these thumbnails that I was doing, like you can see here, in them, I've tried to at least like really roughly block out where the text was going. This was a really heavy, text-heavy scene because a lot of people were talking, so I wound up making tweaks later on when I was actually looking at the real page. But you can see like this panel here, there's so much text there. That's probably a really good indication that that needs to be 2 panels. So I'm just gonna show you how I kind of block out text on a page or in a panel. The first thing I do is I like very roughly, like just a stick figure, sort of say, oh, I think the figure is gonna be doing this in the panel, just so have an idea of where I would want the word balloon in relation to the figure. And then I block in the text. This is just hand lettered, it's nothing special. So this character is waving and saying, hi, this is a comic. This way, once I've got like the actual text blocked in, then I can make adjustments to the figure, because like, what if this took up way more room and I realized I had to actually shift that figure down? All I've got done here is a stick figure, so it's not a big deal. And once I'm sort of satisfied with that composition, then I go ahead and pencil on top of it. Yeah, so one of the other things that we really need to be sure of and careful with when we're thinking about word balloons is that we want to make sure that it's really clear who is speaking in a panel, and in what order, if you've got like 2 different characters speaking in one panel. The reader's eye is always going to jump from top to bottom and left to right as it reads a page in the search to find the next speech balloon. A mistake I sometimes see in a panel with 2 characters speaking, if they both have speech balloons, is just that the orientation of the speech balloons makes you read what they're saying backwards sometimes. This panel here has the figure in the pink speaking first, so that's their first balloon. The balloon we're supposed to read first here, and then the figure in blue is speaking second, so that word balloon is the second word balloon. But if the blue figure is speaking first, that's where things got a little bit tricky. So I just thought I'd show you sort of some thoughts on that. So yeah, we would not be able to keep the word balloons in the same position if we wanted the blue figure to speak first, because our eye obviously goes to this 2 first and then reads the 1, which is the opposite of what we want. One thing we super don't want to do is we don't want to have, you know, like, yes, I'm reading this 1 first and then I'm reading the 2, but having word balloon tails cross looks messy, and it's just not very pleasing. It can get a little confusing. Yeah, don't do this. It doesn't look great. Another thing is, like, even if we just sort of flip the panel and have like 1 up here, like, yes, it's up top, so you know, theoretically we're reading up, down, left, right, but because it's so far to the right, like, I'm still reading 2 first and then reading 1, and then I go, oh, that seems to be backwards, and then read it in the right order. So one solution is to just make sure that the first speech balloon is like higher and either more to the right or like over top. Here it's directly over top of the second word balloon, and then there's, you know, definitely reading this first balloon first and this second balloon second. So if you, you know, were thinking about all the things I talked about today and want to practice your layout skills, then I have an exercise for you. If you're just sort of like not sure where to start and want to play around, hopefully I've made a bunch of worksheets, and hopefully they'll be linked in the description of this video, or VanCAF will have some other way that they've indicated that you can get a hold of these sheets. They go from 3 panel layouts, 4 panel layouts, 5-panel layouts, 6-panel layouts, just all these different sort of like layout ideas that you can use as inspiration or jumping off point. An exercise that I like to do is sort of have somebody give me a prompt. I will also have a list of drawing prompts with these worksheets, and you can take that prompt and try and draw a comic that uses this layout to effectively tell the story from that prompt. I usually set like a 30-minute timer so I don't pressure myself to be perfect. I'm just like letting loose, having some fun, sketching out some ideas. And it's nice to do this with a friend. So if you're both, you know, using the same prompt, setting that 30-minute timer, drawing your page, and then you can come back and be like, oh, I drew it this way. Oh, I drew it this way. Yeah, so that'll be available somewhere. So this is sort of the end of the lecture-y bit of my presentation. I'm now gonna flip over to Photoshop and walk you through how I could lay out the same page 3 different ways. Yeah, I'm gonna do this now. So the script that I've got it's an excerpt from Shedding Velvet. We actually saw the final example of the page earlier in the presentation, but I'm going to show you just like 3 totally different ways to do it. So this is page 9 from the comic that I wrote and James Brandy and I drew called Shedding Velvet. And it's about this girl who moves to a new city for university and sort of is struggling to make friends. So on page 9, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 moments. So we'll have between like 5 and 7 panels on the page. It's dinner time. Ralphie, who's the main character, enters the dining hall searching for somewhere to sit. This girl that she knew in class, whose eye she caught in class, waves her over. Ralphie goes to sit with her. The girl is like, hi, I think we're in the same life drawing class. Her main character is like, yeah, haha. And the girl's like, I'm Sophia. And the main character introduces herself and says, I'm Ralphie. So I'm gonna head over to Photoshop and show you 3 different ways to lay out that page. Hey, we are in Photoshop now. So this is the first version that I'm gonna sketch out of that script that I just showed you. So it had like 7 moments in it. I've broken it down into 6 identically shaped panels. So I'm just gonna go in and sort of like sketch the different moments that I had. I'm just gonna do this in a dark gray. I normally pencil on paper, but for this workshop, I am going to do it in Photoshop. So it's just gonna be stick figures. Also just going to make my brush size a little bit bigger. So the first moment was our main character. She has like a little bob. She is walking into the lunchroom, so I'm just going to draw her here, holding a tray. She's got some food on the tray, and then there are tables in the lunchroom that she's looking at, and there are chairs and people at the tables. This is just like thumbnail level. This is not how I pencil things normally. This is just to get like a really general idea of the composition. And then in the second panel, I'm going to draw the girl from her class. It's waving at her. There's a chair here. And the chair is like, ooh, it's open. And the girl from her class, it's curly hair. It's like she's smiling and she's waving. Like, hey, come sit with me. There's her tray, cafeteria tray. I don't know. And then in this next panel, I'm going to show the table. I've got girl from class over here. Tray. Put this tray here. Got our main character. She's putting down her tray and she's also grabbing this chair to pull it back so she can sit in it. So she's making the move to sit down. And I'm going to put in my loosely blocked out speech balloon. So that character's like, hey. And then I'm going to show them both just like very similar panel. Sorry, just trying to get the angle right here. So, because I want to have both characters in here. It's just like a little bit awkward. Yeah, so now they're both like sitting at the table. And this character is like, I think here in the same life drawing class. Speech bloom. And then this character's like, yeah. And then we're gonna do kind of a close-up on the girl from class. Stick her here, and oops. Here is her speech balloon. She's introducing herself, and then our protagonist is introducing herself. Just super rough. Just trying to get the ideas out here of like what the layout could look like. So yeah, you can see here, we've got just like a really steady rhythm going through the page. All the moments are given sort of the same level of importance, the same kind of space on the page. It's got a very steady rhythm. It's like ba, 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 as we're going through and reading it. So let's change things up a bit. I'm just gonna open another file. So I'm gonna open second version that I've put together. Okay, so I've just jumped ahead here for a moment, and I just, in that sort of pause between a second ago and now, I've just gone in and drawn my panel borders because it's boring and you guys don't need to see me do that. So for this page, my approach is that I isolated from the script the moments that I felt were most important, made those the biggest panels on the page, and then kind of worked back from there. So in my mind, the most important moments of this scene were Ralphie, our main character, walking into the cafeteria and seeing the sea of tables and like not knowing where to sit. So that's going to be our first moment here that I've made the biggest. And then I also felt like the moment where her classmate says, I think we're in the same life drawing class, and sort of like extends that sort of offer of friendship. That to me also felt important because it's sort of like the first time these two characters are interacting. So that's why that's the second biggest panel here. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sketching. So again, I'm going to have, I liked having the character here in the previous, so I think it's nice that we get to see her point of view as she's like stepping into this room, and there are all these tables stretching out ahead of her and people sitting at the tables. She's like, oh man, where do I sit? For some reason, I write cafeterias into like a lot of my comics, and they are really annoying to draw. So they involve a lot of like perspective and people sitting at tables, which is a weird position to draw. So same panel is kind of like similar compositionally. Second panel also going to be kind of similar compositionally, I think. We've got new character. She's saying, oh no, she's not saying anything. She is sitting at a table. Oh man, I'm gonna zoom that out actually, because I want to make sure that we can see the chair that's in front of her. So she's sitting at a table. There is an empty chair here. Do, 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 do. And she is waving. Okay, come over here. Sit with me. Smile. And then, yeah, we've got our lunch, your cafeteria table here. I'm gonna do the same sort of panel composition as before, where this character is pulling out the chair, moving to sit down. And this character is here. So I think we're in the same life drawing class. And speech balloon. So on the previous page, I had yeah, haha here, but I'm actually going to give that its own panel here. I'm just going to show this character sitting down. Maybe she's blushing a little bit. Tucking her hair behind her ear. Yeah. You can see I like put a lot of my speech balloons just up at the top of the panel because it kind of makes things easy. It just doesn't, things don't get confusing when you do that. Yeah, so here is this character. I'm just gonna, oh yeah, maybe she's eating some of her food now. Try and break up this talking heads a little bit. Oh, I'm Sophia. And then I'll just zoom out on that. So as you can see, this page has like a little bit of a different rhythm than the previous one. So this one was very like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then this one is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the reader has like 2 moments where they get to kind of like pause and have time stretch out a little bit in the comic. And it just, I think having this panel be bigger, like it creates that, it sort of stretches out that moment and makes it feel like more apprehensive for this character, where this the whole sea is like waiting out in front of her. So I'm going to open up another file and show you a third completely different way how to lay out this page. Okay, so here's version 3. You can kind of see that I've like made some more like guidelines for myself going into this one just because it's a little bit more complicated. This one is very much, I'm just making a new layer. This one is very much sort of a wild experiment. What if you don't super want to structure your panels on a grid of any kind? You want to just run and do your own thing. This is maybe a little bit more of a manga-y approach. So instead of having, you know, a big panel across the top with our character, I am going to actually have our character sort of like here on her own. And we are seeing her from the view of the cafeteria instead of behind, and she's like carrying her tray, standing, and looking and being like, ooh, I feel nervous. And then to draw a couple panels here beside her. So this is like really focusing on sort of character and emotion versus like setting and location as much. I'm still going to be showing the location because I think that's really important. But yeah, here, these here are my rough panel borders. So in the second panel, again, I'm going to have the other classmate sort of like, wait, oh man, I want to make that smaller. We've still got this empty chair here, and this classmate is waving. But like I said, I want to make sure that we at least have one panel where we like really know where this character is, because like based on just the first two panels, it's sort of like probably a cafeteria, but I want to show that like we know where these characters are. So I'm just going to block in my text. Just going to draw a bubble around it and then draw the tail in a second. So I want to draw our characters from farther away in the cafeteria. So this is the one character, this is our main character. They're now both seated at the table. So I've cut it down from like 6 moments to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 moments. Because yeah, the previous pages had 6 panels, and this one is just going to have 5. So instead of showing this character pulling out her chair to sit down, I'm just showing her already sitting down at the table. You still kind of get the idea that she's moved from one side of the cafeteria to another. So I'm just going to block in some figures really loosely. Obviously, if I was penciling this for real, I would be drawing actual and this is just like improvised perspective. You can see I started to put a table here and then I deleted it just because I felt like it was getting confused with the word, confusing with the word balloon tail. Table over here, maybe, I think. Maybe, I don't know, some windows. So yeah, we got the idea now that, oh, they are in a big room. Then we're gonna have our protagonist here. Again, sort of nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. Blushing a little. And she's saying, yeah. And then we've got both of our characters down here. Again, they're not in a panel, but I'm gonna draw in a way that it's pretty clear that they're not part of this moment. Over here, one character is like Sophia. And our other character introduces herself as well. She's just like sitting here at the table. Maybe this panel is full bleed. Maybe I want to sneak in a little bit. Yeah, so there we have it. This is just like a third, completely different way to panel it. We still have sort of like first moment, second moment going down like this. Yeah, so I just thought it would be fun to show something that was completely different than everything else. So hopefully that's interesting interesting for you too. Yeah. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this workshop on layout. It's pretty much over now. Feel free to leave comments below if you have any questions. I hope you enjoyed this. If you'd like to find out more about me and my work, you can check out my website. It is just this. I always have to spell it out because it doesn't make sense if you read it out loud. And you can find me on various social medias under the name CAG Comics. I'm on Instagram and Twitter for the most part. And thank you so much to VanCAF for having me here today to do this workshop. Yeah, this is it. It's over. This is the end.